All right, that was AC/DC Back in Black Album. You shook me all night. Okay, well, welcome to today's main event, right? My name is Chris Stiers. I will be your host this afternoon. To give you a little idea about my background, I've been in recruiting for about 20 years now. I've been doing this for quite some time. I got myself into corporate recruiting for a little bit, well, staffing first, corporate recruiting, and then all the way to technical recruiting for the last 12 to 13 years. I worked in companies like Rackspace, Indeed, Facebook, Meta, a bunch of startups. Currently at a startup right now, so I've kind of seen a little bit of everything these days. So what I'm going to be talking about today is behavioral interviewing, right? Something you have to understand about behavioral interviewing. It's just telling stories. Right? You want to be able to regale your audience with stories about your past experiences. And so we're going to talk about some things that you could do to really kind of help set yourself apart from other candidates that are out there. Some of the tips and tricks I've got also is going to make you a little bit different, right? I'm not sure if how many people joined the last session that I had, but we talked a little bit about the job market a little bit and how sluggish it is right now. And where this kind of comes into play is being a little bit different than everybody else out there. We're going to talk about let me get to the next slide here. So we're going to talk about just understanding some behavioral interviewing. It's important to understand the why behind a lot of this stuff, right? It's one thing about going through, just kind of someone telling me what to do, but it's important for me to give you like the background behind it. It gives a nice little foundation of exactly why we do what we do and why we ask these questions. We're going to talk about over like some top behavioral interview questions that are typically asked and some of those patterns. I'll even tell you how to find some of these interview questions. I mean, you're never going to know exactly what's going to be asked in every interview, but at least give you some ideas on what you could do to help us prepare for some of that. We're going to talk about the STAR method and how to utilize that to tell a good story, but also what to happen if you don't have a story to tell, right? So I'm going to show you some cool tricks you can do to work with that. And then finally, one of my favorite pieces of the subject is going to be talking about the science of human behavior and how to use it to your advantage. So we're going to talk about some neat little things you could do with that as well. So with that being said, let's kind of understand a little bit about behavioral interviews, right? Why do we ask some of these questions, right? So it's important for us to really help to understand your experiences and backgrounds. The best way to do that is talk about past experiences that you have, right? Past behaviors considered are good indicators of future behaviors, but it also tells us that you've been exposed to a lot of different variables and situations that you've been in. It's one thing about going through a class and learning it through like an academic way versus experiencing it yourself. There's so many different ways that situations can go, and we want to see kind of how you've experienced some of that. We'll talk, what also looks at is like aiming to make like the evaluation process more objectable, right? So we could ask questions all day, is like, the yes, no questions, like, do you have experience, working with data sets? Okay. Yes. Well, I don't, that doesn't tell me much, right? I want to know the story behind it. Tell me about a time when you're working on very difficult data sets or you're working on large data modeling, right? I want to hear stories about some of the things you've done. I want to see kind of the scope of your experience, right? It's also effective for evaluating some of the skills and competencies to level it to the job, right? So a lot of these behavioral questions can come from just about anything. It could be technical. It could be about your soft skills. If you've ever seen on a job description before, good communication, well, just writing it on your resume is not going to be good enough, right? You have to make sure that you demonstrate that in an interview. And that's not easy to do, and I understand, it's second nature for anybody who might be an extrovert, right? Because again, you like talking about some of those things, you like engaging with audiences. But if you happen to be an introvert, this might be a very difficult thing to do. And the only way to really get out of this is to practice, right? So one of the things, I like talking about when it comes to behavioral interviews, the best thing that you can do to prepare for any behavioral interview is honestly to role play. You need to practice telling your interviews. You need to practice telling your stories because that's all behavioral interviews are stories. Okay. If you got to think about, the kind of the questions they ask, like, tell me about a time when, that's talking about your past. So looking for a story about that. A different interview question be like, well, walk me through if you were put into this. Those hypothetical questions, those are going to be a little bit different, right? We're looking for something very specific in those. But we're gonna touch on a combination of both of those today. But it's important to understand why we ask some of these questions, so this way, you can help better deliver some of that. All right, so let's talk about some of the different types of behavioral interview questions. Okay, so first things we've got here is like a situation based. This is going to be the pretty much the most common one that's out there. A good example of something like this is describe a situation when you were competing, when you had competing priorities and you're unable to get everything done on time. Right? We were actually looking for, time you were actually in this situation, how you actually got out of that. Anytime that we ask behavioral interview questions, there's something specific we're trying to get out of this. And this is what I call the heart of the interview question, right? So when we ask you this, we're looking for the heart of it, right? And a lot of times people sometimes miss it. Like they're talking about up here, we want this stuff. And your answer is literally going to encompass this whole thing. But you've got talking points throughout the whole conversation of what you have to hit on. And that's where this kind of comes into place at. Okay. So when we think about some of these different interview questions, think about what are we asking for? Like, what are we looking for out of that? Okay. So an action-based interview question could be like, describe the actions you took to ensure a project was completed on time. Right. In that interview question, we're looking for those actions. We're looking for those steps you took. Right. We've got problem solving. Give me an example of a difficult technical problem you faced and how did you solve it? This question I'm probably going to use as an example quite often tonight, because it's either one of those interview questions that's going to make or break you, right? I would say about 80% of the time, probably maybe it's a little too high, maybe about 70% of the time, people get this question wrong quite often, right? So when we're asking about the difficult technical challenge you faced in your past, like I could really care less on how technical it was, right? What I'm really trying to figure out is how did you solve it? Like, because it could have been something simple, right? But at that time, it could have been very difficult. It could have been a challenge you've never faced before. There could be in time maybe you haven't used a tool, right? And so majority of the folks will overcomplicate this answer to the point where you lose your audience. Right. So you have to keep that in mind. When you're interviewing, you have to make sure your audience is engaged. Right. So it's important when you're actually delivering some of these answers to stay or to understand who your audience is. So, for an example, if you're coming from the banking industry, right, I'm not going to know any of that jargon that you're actually using. You have to know who your audience is, right? So this way you could actually relate to them. They could follow along in your story. And when it comes to the technical question there, some people will try to do too much on that, right? We'll do. Nope, I think I just muted myself. Oh, hold on. There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay, I think I'm back on. All right. So when it comes to the technical question, right, you want to make sure that you're giving the information we're looking for. You don't overcomplicate it. Some people would try to like make this technical question so complicated that your audience has a hard time following along. Keep in mind, they may not know what the right place you were working at and be able to follow along in some of those things. So it's important to make sure that you're following those little pieces. So when we're talking about a difficult technical challenge, it doesn't have to be complicated to anybody else. It just needs to be for just understand kind of how you're in that situation, right? So you want to talk about maybe you've never used Kubernetes before, right? And so it's simple as that. It's like we had a project we were looking for. We just started using containers. I've never used them before, and at that time, I didn't know kind of how to actually utilize this. So it's very simple situation. You don't have to overcomplicate it. But what I'm looking for in that heart of that question is how did you solve that? Right? How did you overcome that? Did you go learn it? Did you have enough time to actually learn it and be able to use it then? Or did you have to bring in outside counsel? Did you have to extend the project out so y'all could absorb this information before trying to utilize it? Right? What did you go through though? How'd you work that out? And if you would have done things differently, let me know. Right. And so that's kind of what we're trying to talk through today is making sure that we identify some of those pieces and we work through them. Okay. But it's important to understand what are we looking for? What is the heart of that question? Okay. And how is our story going to encompass that? Okay. So keep that in mind as we go through some more of these examples. And so then we've got interview questions around teamwork. Provide an example of a successful collaboration with another team. This is really common within software engineering, right? You can be working with product managers constantly, whether the front or the back end. You'll be working with the DevOps team. You're really going to be working with a customer success team. If there's issues with the actual product itself, usually the product manager is going to be doing that, but you're still going to be collaborating with other folks within the organization. So we want to know how you've actually done that. Depending on the position, we might ask a question about tell me about a time when you took lead on a project or you took the initiative on a project, right? We want to hear a story where you stood up and you took control of the situation, right? So try to avoid using we statements and things like that. This is something you did, right? So stand tall with the stuff you did, and show that you brought everybody together. How did you delegate work? Things of that sort. Communication, right? So communication is going to be huge in a lot of these positions, especially if you're applying to like a manager position or like a product manager role where communication is going to be absolutely big. So we might ask questions, tell me about a situation where effective communication was crucial. Or we might go in different directions. Tell me a time when the communication between another team maybe was not great, and how did you patch that? Right? We want to understand kind of like different backgrounds. Now, keep in mind, there are thousands of different variations of all of these questions here. So these are just some good examples there. So adaptability, I mean, if like looking through ambiguity is kind of a tough thing to look at. Describe a situation where you adapt to unexpected changes, right? These changes happen all the time. We get new, we're building something this way, but based on like the customer feedback, not exactly working, so we had to shift, right? I want to know about that story. I want to know how you actually went and adapted those changes to that, right? We're going to talk about achievements oriented. Share a specific accomplishment you're proud of in your career. This is one of the questions I love to ask in my specific interviews. Like, what is your proudest thing that you've developed, or what was the proudest accomplishment that you've had? Right? I want to hear something you're excited about, something that you can get behind. It's like, man, I'm really proud of this piece I did, right? And I want to see that excitement there. We're going to talk about how to utilize that excitement later on. Then we've got some about conflict resolution. This is a really big one too, okay? Especially if you're in more of like a leadership capacity or on the product manager side, there's going to be all kinds of different conflicts. And conflict doesn't mean an actual fight or a disagreement. It doesn't have to be big. It could be something as simple as, I prefer using this software over this one, or I think this tool is better than this one, right? So we want to understand, how have you worked through some of those conflicts, right? Just as a quick example for easy conflict resolution, the first step in conflict resolution is seek to understand. You want to get the full picture first, right? Sometimes miscommunications or making too many assumptions could lead to conflict. Right. So your first step in conflict resolution is seek to understand. You want to understand the bigger picture, because let's say our boss says, hey, we want to utilize this specific tool for this project. Well, you've used something else in the past that you like better and you think might be better. However, you may not have all the pieces of the puzzle. So before you go and saying, hey, I think we should use this, now go and ask. Go, first of all, get the whole pie first. You want to get the whole piece of the puzzle first before you start making any changes or recommendations, right? So seek to understand first. And this even goes as simple as like, if somebody, said something negative about some work that you did, seek to understand, where is that coming from, right? Try to, if you're coming to a place of wanting to understand, you're going to be able to control that conflict so much easier. No one's going to get riled up. Okay. The next thing we're going to be looking for is, if once you have the full piece of the data, now it's time for you to actually bring proof, bring data to the table. Data is key, right? You can't change minds without it. And so if you have the full puzzle, you're able to bring data saying, okay, this is why I think this is the way we go, and this is why, bringing facts to it. Right, saying, okay, I've used this in the past. I've been in a very similar situation. This is kind of what we've done, and this is why we went this way. We tried to use this, was great, but this is where the difference is, what we found. So being able to speak up for yourself and back it up at the same time. There's a difference there. You don't want to just speak up just to speak up, right? We don't want those people. We want someone to speak up, understand the situation entirely, and then bring data to the table, right? That's how you change minds. That's how you change things, right? And so that's a little taste of what it looks like in conflict resolution. Now, sometimes we've got customer service oriented questions, right? Give me an example of a time when you went above and beyond to satisfy a customer. Now, when you think about customers, it doesn't have to be an external customer. It could be an internal customer. Anybody who is, going to be utilizing that product you're working on is a customer, right? So we want to know how you've actually gone above and beyond and how you fix that. And again, there's tons of different questions around something like this too. Time management, my goodness, you're going to be faced a lot of time management situations. How do you prioritize tasks based with multiple deadlines? Or tell me about a time when you were unable to get everything done on time. How did you communicate that? Right? We want to see how you've actually like worked through some of these things. A lot of what we're looking for in a question like that is communication. How did you communicate that? If you are getting overwhelmed, did you talk to your direct manager? We want to see how you've worked through a lot of these situations. And then finally, failures and challenges. Now, this sometimes can be a little bit of a tricky question. Give me a situation when you failed, you made a mistake. How did you recover from that? What did you learn? Right? That one's kind of a tricky one. Most people will try to do like make a negative a positive, right? And it's like, but for this one right here, or maybe it's the interview question is like, tell me about a time when, or usually here's like, tell me about your biggest weakness. Whew. Okay, so if you ever get that question there, try to avoid actual, saying something that's a positive and make it a negative. It's like I like to work a lot of hours to get all my job done. That's not what we're looking for. We want to see some humility. We know that you're not perfect, and we want you to know that you're not perfect. Everybody has something to work on. Even I have something to work on. I've been doing this for a long time, and public speaking and things like that, when I get nervous or if I get excited, I tend to talk really fast. You might have already noticed that tonight. And these are things that I work on. And so as a musician, I've been playing music for quite some time, but I start tapping my foot like a metronome and start slowing my speech patterns down. So this way I don't over ramble or I don't speak too fast and lose my audience, because it's important to make sure your audience is engaged and that they are understanding what's actually happening. So for my weakness, I end up talking too fast. I rush through things sometimes. My attention to detail can be a little bit wonky, but that's why I have these steps in place to prevent those weaknesses from actually becoming failures. Right? That's what we're looking for in those questions right there. How does those weaknesses prevent you from, because we want to know that you're human. Everybody's human. Everybody has weaknesses. So really think about it. What is that weakness and what are you doing to overcome that? For example, like where something has to be a very, attention to details, like when I create job offers, you always have to be very careful. You're still going to make some mistakes, but there's still a lot of nuances that you have to make sure you pay attention to. So before I send it out, I step away from my desk for 5 minutes, come back and reread it, make sure everything looks good before I send it out, before approvals and things of that sort. But we have checks and balances in place, but we add those in there to make sure we all look good. So it's important to make sure you find that humility, know where those weaknesses are, but what are you doing to compensate for them sometimes? We want to show that you're actually working on some of that. And when it comes to actual mistakes that you've made, everybody's made mistakes. Don't be afraid to talk about a mistake you've made, as long as you've learned from it. I knew a guy who actually took down the entire network. This is back, oh my goodness, about 20 years ago, 21 years ago. This is back when networks were not kind of a star network. It was actually a ring network. And if you unplug one computer, the whole thing goes down. Yeah, I had somebody who did that one time and took down an entire like building. So, and he was talking about, that situation that he worked through. And it's like, well, understanding kind of how it all works in the first place before making any changes made a huge difference. But we all make mistakes, right? So it's important to make sure that we admit them, because we're looking for folks who could actually admit those mistakes, who can learn from them. Because if you don't make mistakes, you're never learning or you're not pushing yourself. We want people to make mistakes because that means you're pushing the boundaries of your knowledge and you're testing, the limits of things that are happening around you. If we didn't make mistakes, nothing would ever get done. I mean, Elon Musk is the absolute best when it comes to making mistakes. I mean, he loves it when his rockets blow up, because that means there's data right there for them to actually learn from it. And you could actually take this concept when it comes to interviewing as well, right? Every time that you interview, that is going to be an opportunity to learn from possible mistakes, right? Understanding how the audience is listening to your interviews, reading the body language. Did you get the job? Did you not get the job? Auditing that interview and figuring out what you could have done differently is going to be a huge tool for you. Every interview that you do is going to be a way to gather data, right? We're going to touch on that a little bit when it comes to, understanding how to get interview questions, right? These are a lot of those things that we're kind of looking for there. Okay. So building out interview questions, right? Nobody, again, when you walk into an interview and you go into this, you never know what's going to be asked, and you never will know. The only person that's ever going to know what might be asked in that interview is going to be that very specific recruiter. Okay. Because I've worked at all these different companies and different sizes and whatnot. And I could tell you, even when I was at like Indeed, for an example, I hired the exact same job profile, but for four different departments. Every one of those had completely different interviews and interview questions, right? So even if you might be interviewing for the same position, it could be completely different. Right. So don't assume that you know anything going into this, but try to be as best prepared as you possibly can. Right. So let's talk about some ways that you could actually look for other interview questions or interview questions that could help you best prepare for this. Okay. First things first, we're going to look at is previous interviews. We talked about this, right? There's a million different ways for these different interview questions to be asked. So you might want to start building yourself a repository of interview questions and answers. I've been doing this for the past, I think I started this about 13 years ago, and I have about 75 different interview questions I've been asked over the years and that I've added to. Then I even add answers to for each one of those interview questions. And I even have several answers to each one of those because as I grow in my career, those answers are going to change. But I also like taking some of those experiences that I've had and put them on paper. So I could always go back to that because sometimes you're going to have a hard time forgetting. So I challenge everybody, especially for a lot of those folks who are fairly new in the career, maybe you're a new grad and you're just kind of getting out there. There's no better time than now to start building this out because what you're doing is you're laying the ground foundation for better interviewing throughout your entire career. You're going to interview so much and it's going to change so often as well. But it's good to have a good foundation. So start now. Start now. Like before you start interviewing and going out there, start looking at what interview questions are going to be asked. What are common interview questions, right? And then building your answers based on those questions. And you want to practice those over and over and over and over and over until it feels natural, right? But you want to make sure that you put thoughts to paper. The next person you can ask is going to be the recruiter. Okay. The recruiter is hands down going to be your biggest and best resource of them all. Believe it or not, people don't know this, but we want you to get the job. I'm serious. We want you to get the job. Think about it. It's like a recruiter. We are like the salespeople of the HR world, right? Our main function is to put butts in seats. We have to hire people for what the company's looking for. But we are in a unique opportunity to have be able to help folks out getting the jobs they're looking for while filling the jobs that the company needs with the people they're looking for. We're that middle person. So we get that reward in there, but it's a sales job at the end of the day. We have goals and metrics that we have to hit. So once you pass our interview, right, and you're moving on to the next steps, at that point in time, we're now your ally. We want you to get the job. So we're asking about compensation and things like that. We just gather that information to know what it's going to get you to sign the contract, right? We're doing this for you. We majority of the time, we'll actually do most of the offer negotiation for you, right? That's what we're here for. So utilize us as a resource. So ask the recruiter what could be expected in the interview. What are some areas that you've seen people in the past interviews fail? Right? If there's any documentation to help you prepare. When I was at Meta, I had a huge document that I would send to folks to help prepare for that. I had a big long speech to do that. But there's even some classes that they would be able to sign up for. But there's so many resources out there for some of this stuff, right? So look for it. The next thing is going to be like company page, right? So, if you're looking at like an Amazon interview, they even have let me go back here, back previous, there we go. So you got the Amazon leadership principles here, right? So if you're interviewing at Amazon, you need to know all of these leadership principles. Each interview that they have, they're going to cover about two or three of these in each one of those interviews. And the problem is you don't know which ones they're looking for, but the recruiter might tell you, right? But it's important to make sure you do research on the company, right? Find out exactly what this company does. What are their core values? Make sure the interview question answers that you have are going to incorporate those core values, right? So make sure you keep that in mind. Another good place to actually look for a lot of this stuff is Team Blind. Team Blind is a great website. I love this site. The best way I like to describe it is if Glassdoor met Reddit. It's completely anonymous, so anybody post anything on that thing. And so it's great to kind of get, interview data that's out there. You've got Glassdoor. There's tons of forums out there. Connecting with current employees. Make sure you go to LinkedIn and look for other alumni that currently work there. They might be able to help you out with some of these interviews, right? Anything you can possibly find. Going to the company website, again, looking up those core values. It's important to look for that. And this is a neat little trick that you could do as well. So we're looking at LinkedIn here. Let's say, for an example, we're looking for an actual job itself. We're looking at for a software engineering position. Now, you could use this as a tactic to help you like practice interview questions. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be hands down accurate, but this gives you an ability to actually help you practice for what could possibly be in this, right? All you're going to do is just ask questions from the actual job posting itself that could give you an interview questions, right? So, for an example, tell me about a time when you deployed and supported the infrastructure that facilitates the aspects of the security capabilities of an organization. Just add, tell me about a time before any of these. These are all could be interview questions. Think about it. Tell me about a time when you had to plan, implement, and maintain security measures to protect your organization's computer networks, right? All of these could be interview questions. And this goes for each one of these here, right? You could turn these into any of that. All right, let's see, what's this one here? This is at One Crew. Okay. Let's see. Tell me the time when you built and launched new products and features independently and with the team, right? So we'll see a lot of this stuff here. So this is a great way to look it up. Another great resource, Chat GPT. Let me tell you, this has been like the godsend when it comes to coming with interview questions because I've been doing this for such a long time. You get like writer's block. I use Chat GPT to help me get some good interview questions. Just type a little prompt in there. It says like, what are some good behavioral interview questions for a internship at Google for a software engineer? You'd be surprised. It comes up with really good examples. And that right there gives you a really good idea of kind of what could be asked in those things too. So utilize those AI tools. They're going to be super awesome. Because I use them to build out some of these interview questions sometimes. Because, as a recruiter, I mean, at the company, at a startup, I work on like 20 different recs at one time. Like I'm not expected to know anything and everything about everything. And my hiring managers, bless them, but they are not the best at coming up with questions. So sometimes I have to help facilitate that. And that's a fun little tool to help me make that happen. But, and so what I want y'all to start doing, even today, just start writing down what are some good interview questions. You can keep it in a Word doc, Excel, however you want to do it, but build a repository of interview questions and answers, right? Because you need to map this stuff out. It's hard enough to already when you're actually in an interview to come up with this stuff right at the top of your head, right? It's, your adrenaline's pumping, you're nervous, maybe you've never interviewed before, especially being early in your career, but it's nerve-wracking, right? And if you're nervous and that adrenaline's pumping, your brain's not exactly firing in all cylinders as it typically would, right? So you want to give yourself the best advantage by preparing, right? If you've ever studied for a test before and you walked into that thing, you see the answers of the test, and you're like, yeah, I've got this. You're going to have that same feeling if you do this. And if you don't, you're going to be a deer in the headlights the whole time, right? So I can't stress enough. It's so important to write this down, to make sure you map it out, and then practice, 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 practice. Okay. So let's talk about the STAR method. Now, there are a ton of different methods that are out there. This is probably the most common one, the most heard of. Now, the biggest reason why we like the STAR method is because it's a method of telling a good story. Again, all behavioral questions are stories, right? So if they ask about a prior example or a prior time that you've done something, we're looking for a story. And that's all this does. It just maps out a good story, right? So let's think about this. So we have the situation, task, action, result. The situation is just giving examples. It's like setting the scene of what's actually happening. You're bringing your audience into your story by setting the scene. This is the company I'm working at. This is what I was doing. This is all the little things you need to know, all the adjectives to describe what it is that was going on so I could picture it. The tasks are, I'm like, okay, these are the tasks I had to knock out. This is usually a pretty short one there. The actions, this is probably the most important part of this entire thing. Now, where people mess up, sometimes they focus too much on situations, not as much on actions. I want to know what you did. What did you specifically do in all of this? And I want details. This is where I want details because this right here is going to give me the indication that you know what you're talking about. You've been in that situation. Even to the point when you're talking about like a conflict resolution, I want to know the part where you if you're face to face, you pulled someone to the side in a private room, right? I wanted to make sure that this is a conversation between me and this person right here because I didn't want anybody to overhear it, right? Hearing those little tiny details gives us, insight into your foresight of when it comes to handling some of these complex situations, right? We want to see some of those things. So action is going to be the most important part. Results, obviously, we want to know that outcome. It could be positive or negative. Keep that in mind. It could be either one of those, right? And you always want to follow up with these as like in hindsight being 2020, I would have done this a little bit differently. Or you could actually rephrase it to how would you handle that situation at this said company, right? So maybe you are working in, company XYZ, and maybe it's a startup, right? And so you've handled the situation in a startup, and now you're interviewing for Amazon. Well, how would you handle that situation at Amazon? The scope and scale of what they're doing is going to be a little bit different. So you're going to add a little extra spice to the end of that, saying, "I was like, this is how I handled the situation in the past. Now, knowing how Amazon does what they're doing, this is what I would do differently to make sure that, my answer kind of hits all the things we're looking for." Or if you're looking at the leadership principles that are here, if you need to add that little extra piece in that, like understanding, Amazon's important, has a big thing about having a backbone and disagreeing to commit, right? I would have actually, disagreed a little bit more with the hiring manager on this one once I had the data and told him, like, hey, I want to, once I have it, like, I feel that we should use this software instead, right? I wish I would have pushed back on the manager at that time. So it's looking at that hindsight 2020, keeping in mind of that company you're interviewing for, and then answering that question, even though you may not have had that. Okay. So it's a neat little way of kind of navigating through this. Now, so again, this is just a storyboard to tell a story. It's everything in a linear set. Every story you've ever heard follows this similar pattern. If you don't believe me, listen to this. The situation was a princess was trapped in a very tall tower. The task was the knight had to save the princess. The actions was he fought a dragon. The results was he was eaten by the dragon, right? It's just a linear way of telling a story. Happens every single time, but those details matter. So keep that in mind when you're actually telling these stories. Like, does the audience understand this situation I'm in? If they don't, okay, how can I fill in those gaps to make sure they fully understand what's actually happening? Okay. Now, the more you tell a story, the better it's going to get. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room, you have a story. Maybe it's a funny story you like to tell at a party, right? Where you go into this, it's like you tell a story over and over and over. And honestly, every time you tell a story, it gets a little bit better. This is how those fish tails go from this big to like that big. It's a little bit better, but most importantly, your details get consolidated to like what the audience is mostly looking for. The more you tell a story, the more comfortable you're going to feel with it. The more you're going to be able to convey what it is that you're trying to get. Your timing gets a little bit better. Even as an example, as a stand-up comedian. You think a stand-up comedian goes up on stage for the first time and starts telling jokes? Like, no, they write it down, they rehearse it, they practice telling those stories. Now, they're not going to be exactly the same every single time they say it. No, we don't want something scripted, right? It's going to be genuine, but they've worked on the timing, right? They know where to pause. They know what details to add and what details to leave out. But the only way to do that is to practice, is to rehearse. Now, not to toot my own horn, but I'm a very good interviewer. I love interviewing. Like I love telling people stories about that. It might be my extrovert and whatever it is, but I love interviewing. Like I'm really good at it. I love telling stories. Now, that's something that I'm natural at. Now, even before I do an interview, I role play. Absolutely. I'll reach out to a buddy of mine. I was like, listen, do you have an hour? I want to go over some of these interview situations I've been through, or these interview questions and situations I've been through. I want to make sure that they're landing. I want to make sure you can follow and understand it because you can't assume your audience knows anything that you're talking about, right? So you want to bounce it off with different people. You want to practice. So if everybody's connected to this community, start connecting with people online. Use the people around you. Start working with other classmates. You have to role play these interviews. It's so valuable. I mean, that's probably the one thing I want you to take away from today is role-playing interviews. Just practice, 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 practice. That right there is going to make you such a good interviewer. The more, even especially if you're uncomfortable with it, this is what we call in the psychology world as exposure therapy. I never took psychology, but I know about it. It's exposure therapy, right? So the more you get involved in these different situations, the more comfortable you're going to feel in it. The more interviews you do, the more comfortable you're going to feel, right? So the more you do things, the more you're going to feel better about this. Now, this is going to be really important for, especially for the folks of you that are maybe new grads, are looking for internships, right? You're not going to have stories for everything that they're asking, right? So remember, a star question is only like answers for stories about your past, right? You cannot answer with the star method for a hypothetical present or future answer, right? So if I were to say, walk me through how would you handle how would you handle a conflict with a manager? That's not about your past. So you would not use the star example. You would use the process. Essentially, what it is you're going to be talking about the actions, the action portion of your star method. Like, this is what I would do if I was in that hypothetical situation, right? Those are the two different. So you have to make sure you listen. You've got past, present, and future. So depending on how they ask it, how that's going to work. Now, if you've actually built out star answers for all of these questions, again, you're going to take that action portion and that's your process answer, right? So we're not looking for a past story. So keep that in mind. So if I were to say, and not everything is going to be, a star method. For example, the tell me about yourself question. One of my favorites, we're going to talk about this later. You're not going to use the star method in that, right? It's only going to be when they're looking for past examples of situations that you've been in. That's the only time you're going to use the star method. The other side of that depends on how they ask the questions. Most of the time, it's like looking for those action pieces there. Now, what I love to talk about this is, what if you don't have a past example? Okay. Don't panic. I love that little picture there. I'm a huge fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic, right? The worst thing that you could do in an interview is panic, right? Keep in mind, when you actually get into an interview, you either know it or you don't know it, right? That's it. So don't panic about it. It's either you know it or you don't know it. Okay. So let's say, for an example, you're a fresh college grad, right? So you haven't worked anywhere, right? And they ask you a silly interview question, which they probably will not, by the way. But if they do, let's say they ask you, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a manager. I don't have a conflict with a manager. Maybe you have a conflict with a teacher. That would be a good example. Or you have a conflict with another, maybe someone else that was working on a project. That would be a good example, right? But maybe you don't have one, or you can give those examples, but you want to actually give it in a hypothetical way of this. You could turn a supposed to be a star answer into a process answer. So if they were to ask me, it's like, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a manager. Well, to be honest, I'm still fairly new in my career. I haven't had an opportunity to really push back on a manager yet because I'm still absorbing, I'm still learning. And I'm just not at a place now where I'm confident in my skills to push back just yet. However, if I was in that situation, this is what I would do. I would seek to understand the full story about everything. If I still think that I have a different way of doing things, I would gather my data and I would present it to them in a very professional and one-on-one situation, right? So I took something they're looking for, a past example where I don't have, and I'm giving them an answer that shows that I can do the job, right? And this shows a couple of different things. This shows, number one, integrity. You're not trying to lie. You're not trying to make something up or try to put a square peg in a round hole, right? Number two, it shows that you can think on your feet. You haven't been in this situation before, but you have come up with an answer regardless. And number three, without being in this situation prior to the past, you've actually have a good answer to how you would have handled that situation, because everybody has gone through different situations in their past, and majority of the things that there are problem solving, how that typically works is a accumulation of all the different experiences that we have, and we problem solve based on all of that knowledge we have, right? It's tough to explain that kind of thing, so you want to turn that from a past to a present kind of answer, right? So don't panic when some of those things happen, right? If it does, give them an answer that could be quite close to it, and you could even ask questions about it. You can even tell them, it's like, honestly, I haven't been a part of I haven't had a conflict with the manager, but I have had conflicts with like maybe a teacher or maybe with a coworker. I could get me not a coworker, but maybe another student on a project that we're working on, or maybe who was the project leader. I can give you that example, or I could tell you what I would do in that in particular situation. You can ask questions in that interview to gauge what they want to find out in that conversation, right? So keep that in mind, right? It's a two-way, it's a conversation, right? And something I tell anybody that goes through my interview process is I expect you to interview us as much as we interview you. So don't be afraid to ask questions in the interview, right? But especially when it comes to understanding the full scope of the question, don't be like, sometimes some companies, we ask questions that are specifically, vague, only for you to ask questions to gather more data. And please do. If you need more data to give them a better answer, ask for it. Don't forget to do that. Okay, one of my favorite subjects that no one ever talks about. And now, this is a whole thing about mimicry. It's the model of emotional contagion. Okay. So this is something that I love teaching about because I've seen this in practice from myself, and I've seen it actually come out in interviews. And I'm like, I have to tell people this. All right. So I'm sure a lot of you have been in a lot of different social situations where, maybe, you're a small group of people and someone's telling a story that they're really excited about, that they're really kind of getting everybody engaged. You're excited for them, right? There's something about emotional contagion in the human beings that we just can't help ourselves. But if someone's happy, we're going to be happy. If someone is excited and energized by what they're doing, we're going to feel that same excitement, energized. We're going to feel excitement. If someone is discombobulated and nervous, we're going to feel uneasy. So this is why it's very careful when it comes to interviewing to bring out that excitement, that passion, right? The things that get you excited about what you're doing, right? These are the things that are going to help to actually make or break an interview. I am not kidding. I've been in several interview feedback sessions where they were talking about, I was like, man, the candidate really didn't have all of the experience we were looking for. They're missing this big old chunk here. But their excitement for what they're doing gives me the confidence that they want to learn it, that they're hungry for this, right? That excitement piece can go so long. That could make or break your interview. And so if I'm an interviewer and I've kind of engaged in this conversation, if you're kind of humdrum and monotone and blah blah blah, I'm not going to feel excited about it. Maybe your information is good, but okay, cool. You're just like everybody else I'm talking to. You need to be excited. And one thing I want you to wrap your head around. Most of your folks are going to be, new college grads. Some of you might have actually been in the workforce for a while, but I want you to step back and think. Go look at your student loan debt. Go look at how much money you have spent. Go look at how much time you have dedicated to your degree, how much time you dedicated to your craft. This is your career. This is not just a stepping stone. This is your life. And if you're not even excited about that, you're doing the wrong thing. Get out of it. Don't even bother with it. If you're not excited about it, leave it at the front door. Go find something you are excited about. Otherwise, you're going to be miserable. You spend majority of your time in your job. Make sure it's worth it. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Okay, think about that. And if you're not excited about it, don't bother, because I want people who are excited about what they do. I got lucky. Not everybody falls into the career that they're looking for like I did. I love what I do, right? And so I want people to be excited about what they do, to at least sound excited about it, right? And we're going to talk about how the tell me about yourself question can kind of set that up. But think about this. Think of the examples you have. Be excited about it, right? Be prepared for it. And so one of the things I like to do, and think about kind of like body language too. So you see I'm using a lot of hand motions. I'm being engaged with the camera. You have to do that too. Pause for dramatic effect. I mean, this is something my friend used to tell me, is like, because again, I told you I talk really fast. He tells me all the time, he's like, Stiers, you need to pause for dramatic effect. You're dramatic enough as it is, but pause for a second, let people to absorb what you're saying before you get into it. And I love that term. So pause for dramatic effect, right? So we want to use this excitement. We want to use this to our advantage. Now, it could actually backfire and be a disadvantage. Now, I've interviewed folks, and it's very difficult to do if you're monotone. Let me tell you, if I'm talking to somebody and they're interviewing like this, I'm like, yeah, I like doing this one time, and I was actually feeling like, oh my gosh, like it's driving me absolutely bonkers, right? Don't be monotone. That's why it's important to role play to know if you are like that. Video record yourself interviewing. Are you excited about what you're talking about? So all the stories that you talk about in your past, you should be excited about telling them. Someone genuinely wants to know you, wants to know stories about you. Be excited about that. How cool is that? How cool is it that someone's asking about you? You're never going to have that kind of opportunity like that before. And they want to ask stories that you've done before in the past. It's actually kind of cool. So you got to think about it that way. It's not a test. I mean, it is, but it's not. They're just talking about your experiences. So utilize that to your advantage. Okay. But again, practice, practice, practice. I'm going to keep saying that over and over because you cannot understand the importance of practicing this stuff. It's going to make you so much better at this. It'll blow your mind. Okay. Especially if you've never interviewed before. So think about exposure therapy. Think about being excited about that. Now, when you're thinking about stories in your past, I'm saying when you build this repository, be very careful in how you actually build it out. So I'm sure a lot of y'all have probably taken a public speaking course, hopefully at some point in time of your life. If you've ever used those flashcards, probably not these days. Usually you have like a prompter or whatnot. But when you do a public speaking presentation, you're not reading a script. So when you're building out these interview questions and answers, do not do not memorize a script. I can tell you right now, I will decline you immediately if you are reading a script. If you're reading me a memorized script that you've had in your past, I will immediately the interview's done. It's not genuine. And it's easy to tell because there is a huge difference between written and verbal communication. Huge difference. We tend to add more buzzwords in written communication. It's more polished versus like a normal conversation. Like today, none of this is scripted that I'm talking about, right? It's all kind of off the cuff, right? Every time I tell an interview story, we're going to go over the tell me about yourself here in a minute. Every time I tell that, it's different. And it's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. But what you're going to write out is going to be a, a storyboard. Write down the talking points you want to make sure that you hit. So this way it reminds you of the story itself. And if you can't remember the story, then you didn't practice it enough. You need to be able to remember the story. You need to embody that story, right? So when you're writing this down, so when you have like an interview question, say, tell me about a difficult technical challenge you've had. You want to write it out in the STAR method. The situation was, okay, paint me a picture so I can bring myself into that, right? Let me know what those tasks were that I can understand. Let me know what actions you took that I can understand. You see this understanding thing? It's bringing your audience in. Okay. But make sure you write some of these things down, but do not write it as if you're reading a script because that will fail you immediately. So don't do that. Right. So just put down talking points. Right. When I talk about the flashcards, again, that might show my age a little bit there, but we had little flashcards and whatnot. And we're actually talking about, we had like talking points as we went through this. Okay. So that's my little soapbox about making sure it's like just do not memorize a script because that will hurt you so much worse than anything else you could possibly do. I'd rather you fumble through an interview than write that in there. So let's talk about the tell me about yourself question. This is probably one of my favorites and most hated interview question there is. And I love teaching it because as a recruiter, I want to see things differently. Now, first things first, again, with any interview question that there's out there, we want to ask ourselves, why are they asking this question? What do they want to get to know out of it? Believe it or not, this interview question is just an icebreaker. I don't care what you say. It's literally just to get you comfortable in an interview. It's an interview question where there's no wrong answer. You're just talking about yourself. Now, you could go wrong with how you talk about yourself. You could bore me off the planet, make me want to slam my head on the desk, because everybody that I ask this question to gives me the exact same answer, to the point where I almost stopped asking the question. They give me the same answer. And you're going to hear different variations of this and different opinions of this, but this is mine, right? So most everybody will start talking about their resume. Like I'm currently like, and don't ever introduce yourself, by the way, as like, my name is Chris Dyers and I'm working at this. No, don't do that. And it's like, people will talk about what company they're working at, what are they doing? They start walking me through their resume. I hate that because I didn't ask you about your resume. It's in front of me right now. I'll ask about that later. I want to know who you are. I just want you to get comfortable in the interview. And if you start reading me your resume, you've already bored me. It's boring. No one wants to hear about you talking about your resume. It's boring. But you know what people do love hearing about is a good origin story. Marvel made billions of dollars off origin stories. Everybody wants to hear a good origin story. Give that to us, right? Give us something that we don't ever hear. Everybody we ask that question gives us the same resume answer. Be different. This is a sluggish job market. I guarantee you, if you follow this, you are going to stand out. I promise you. Okay. The way I do the tell me about yourself answer is like, I want to talk about your past, your present, and future. The past, I want to hear the origin story. What was that catalyst? What was that spark in your life that sent you down the direction that you're on? Maybe you're a software engineer, mathematics was your thing. Well, think further back. Keep asking questions until you get to the root. I'm talking about keep asking this, and I love this. I love doing this with students and whatnot, and talk about why this, why, until we get to the basics of it, right? It's like, okay, cool. You want to study mathematics? Why? Well, in high school, well, why in there? Well, when I was a kid, like I loved puzzles. I loved seeing things worked out the way they were. Well, that's where you start. Get to the root of it. What is it in your core that sent you on the path that you're on now? It could have changed, right? That's perfectly fine. But I want to know that origin story. I want to know that spark because number one, no one ever hears these. But if you're talking about something that got you into what you're doing, you're going to innately be excited about it. It's going to be natural. And this is the time to set the tone of this. If anybody in an interview asked me to tell me, like, ask me, tell me about yourself, I know immediately that I'm going to crush this interview because I'm setting that mimicry we talked about, I'm setting on a very high, positive, excited note. Take advantage of that. Make sure that you do what you can to feel good about it. So talk about what gets you excited about it. Talk about your own story. What was that catalyst? What made it happen for you? And then briefly go over your history. Only the major talking points. You don't have to go for every job that you're at, just the major talking points. You heard a little bit about my origin story at the beginning of the class today, right? I talked about some of the companies I went to, just lightly touch over it, right? Talk about then talk about present a little bit, what you're doing, why you're looking to make a change, or that you were rift or whatever happened, right? Or maybe you were studying, or maybe you're just now getting into the job market, like what's actually happening. And the present piece of this is going to be proactively answering a question we are already going to ask. So we typically like to ask, why do you want to work for, let's use Google for an example. Why do you want to work for Google? We're going to ask that question. Well, you're going to get ahead of this, and nobody is prepared for you to do this. It's going to shock the recruiter, it's going to shock the interviewer because you're already answering the question before we can even get to it. Okay. So not only are you starting the interview on a very positive and excited note, you're also surprising them by getting ahead of what they're looking for. It's gonna give them goosebumps. I'm telling you, I promise it'll work well. So in full transparency, I'm going to give you my tell me about yourself answer. Right. And again, tell you every time I tell a story, it's going to be a little bit different because again, I haven't written it down. I haven't memorized the script, but it's something I do tell often. And the more you tell this, the more comfortable you're going to feel about it. Right. So honestly, like I fell into recruiting about 20 years ago. I was working at back office collections and whatnot for Verizon Wireless back in the day, and the HR manager came in and said, "Hey, does anybody want to go door to door? See if we can get people to apply to the company out here." I was like, you know what? Get me out of the office. Let me go have some fun. So after a day, we went door to door. Like the HR manager saw my excitement and just my energy that I had, and he asked if I wanted to be a recruiter. Never heard of the position before in my entire life, but let me tell you, after the first couple of months of doing this job, I knew at that moment this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life. As a recruiter, we have a unique opportunity to change people's lives. I've moved families across the US, I mean, hell, just across the globe in hopes of getting them in a better opportunity for themselves and the family, but I'm also helping organizations build a product they need to with the right people that they need to have happen. Now, I started my career in staffing, well, actually there, but mostly in staffing for a little bit, and then in corporate recruiting. Finally moved my way into technology. With the background in cybersecurity, this was right in my wheelhouse. Worked at companies like Rackspace, moved my way to Indeed, to Meta. Worked for it was great work for some of these companies, but I really wanted to see what the startup life was like. So I've been working at some startups. I built recruiting teams from the ground up. I built these processes from the ground up. All this has been great, but you know what has me like itching at this moment is getting an opportunity at Google. Like younger, like I remember when I was younger, I was using Ask Jeeves. I mean, this might be a little before your time, but Ask Jeeves was our search engine back then. But it wasn't until I started using Google and I saw the power of that, to the difference between the two. And then what y'all have done with this product is absolutely bonkers, right? You've got G Suite. Like I haven't touched a Microsoft product in 10 years. Right? I want to be a part of something who's going to be that innovation leader. But with bringing in my experience from large companies like Meta and the startups I've done it, I'm bringing a different perspective coming into this, and I want to see what I could do with this company. I want to be a part of something big. That's what has me here today. That's it. Simple as that. But it takes that time that you have to do the research on the company, right? And that's a very tough thing to do, right? And so the last little nugget I'm going to give you on this is the knowledge you have at the company is going to make a huge difference. And it's tough to do sometimes, but you could sell any company that you're interviewing for. Just tie a piece of personal information to that, or even make up something that makes them that you understand what the product is. Someone someone asked me for an example the other day for like an insurance company. It's like, say you want to work for State Farm. I'm like, okay, nobody wants to work for an insurance company. That is not a very sexy company to work for. However, I'm going to make it sound great, right? For an example, and it's like, well, most companies, most folks won't be excited about trying to come to an insurance company. But let me tell you, there was a time I was actually driving to my brother's wedding. I was fairly young. I had my infant son with me. It's just him and I doing a cross country trip. Didn't have a lot of money at that time, but we were in a bit of a fender bender, and it disabled my car. Like I was not able to continue on the trip, but it was the insurance agent that came in. Not only did they show up with a rental car at the accident, but I was able to get to the wedding on time. I was able to get the things I was done. Being a part of that and knowing that I could actually have that impact in someone else's life is something I want to be a part of. That's a completely made up story, but it sounds good. Find something personal you can attach yourself to the actual company that you're looking for. Maybe it's an oil company, right? Well, oil needs plastic. You got to use plastics every day. Everything on my desk is made from oil, right? So being a part of something, or you can even look at like even the climate change. There's some oil companies that are working on trying to enhance some of that. Find something, do research. And I can't stress that enough. You have to research these companies. You have to research this, right? And again, the more work that you put into this, the better you're going to get out of it. So I know it's difficult for a lot of folks who are going to be who are still, young in their careers, are just now graduating and you're just kind of looking for that internship. A lot of this stuff, again, is stuff that again, I'm building you the foundation material here. This is stuff you could take from every job that you've ever done, and you're going to be able to add on to this. So, find a practice buddy. find someone you could role play these interviews with, because that is going to be an interview for companies that maybe you may not have known it to interview for. Right. We talk about like tier one companies. People are like, I want to interview at like Meta and Amazon and things like that. But okay, that's great, but you still need to gather experience. You need to actually get some experience. So don't so don't forget about some of those smaller companies out there, because they're building some great things too. And they might still get some of the opportunities you're looking for as well. And each one of these companies that you interview and every interview you get from, that's data, right? We need data to be better, right? And so don't forget to bring in that data, to absorb it, to be able to write some of that stuff down, and then we're good from there. So I appreciate everybody's time that y'all spent with me tonight. I hope that y'all got a lot of really good information from this. I appreciate everybody being patient with it all. And yeah, that's my little spiel there. I hope y'all have a fantastic day. Let me add my LinkedIn profile here. So if anybody does want to connect, you're more than welcome to do so as well. Let me add this here. There we go. And not to mention, I've been working with JobBite for a little bit now. Fantastic product. I know we didn't get to talk a little bit about tonight, but I definitely like to give a little product shout out to JobBite. So let me tell you, if you're looking for something that's going to help kind of align your resume and your experience to this, it's a fantastic tool for that. So by all means, please take a look at this. It's a great tool for it, and I guarantee you it is going to help you out as well. I'm not a big advocate on sharing like tools and things like that, but this is definitely one that I believe in too. So by all means, take a look at this thing. It's a fantastic product. It's going to help align you with some of this stuff, and hopefully you'll still be ready to go for that. All right. Well, that's my time. Again, appreciate everybody's time tonight. I hope you all got something out of this, and I will see y'all around.